Today in episode 248 of the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast, you're cleared hot to learn leadership lessons from an Apache gunship pilot. That's right, folks. It's leadership from the air today. Are you ready for this? All right, let's do it. Welcome welcome all to the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast, a weekly podcast series dedicated to helping you hit peak performance across the three domains of leadership. Those being leading yourself, leading your team, and leading your organization. This podcast couples my 20 years of military experience as a senior Canadian Army officer with world-class guests to bring you the most complete podcast on leadership going. And for more, feel free to check out our website at movingforwardleadership.com. And with that, let's get to the show. Yes, welcome one, welcome all. It is your Chief Leadership Officer, Scott McCarthy. And so good to have you here today as I air this episode 248. Wow. Never thought I'd get there. We're almost at 250. Crazy. Anyway, here we are. And yeah, we are interviewing Lieutenant Brian Slade. And you'll hear later why I emphasize the Lou in Lieutenant Colonel Brian Slade in a little bit. Anyway, we're talking all about leadership lessons from his time as an Apache gunship pilot. But more importantly, I guess, to point out is the fact that he was a commander of a company of Apache gunships in Afghanistan during the early days of the war over there. So, a lot, let me tell you, a lot of leadership lessons coming out of him in this episode. So, it's interesting because for me, I was there where he was. So he and I were talking about his book, Cleared Hot. And you can check it out. It's in the show notes. And again, the show notes link for this episode is easy. Just go to lead.boss.com/248. And there near the guest resources section, you'll find a link to grab a copy of his book, Cleared Hot. And by the way, I've read it. It's excellent. Can't recommend it enough. So much lessons in there. And it's not just about leadership, but it's also a lot about resilience and mental toughness, right? Things that we as leaders definitely need to have. So it was interesting for me because he, one part in the book, talks about how he started operating out of Kandahar, which is where I was when I was in Afghanistan. So I can picture his stories come to life. So I know that's not for all of you, but for some of you, this may be applicable. Anyway, Brian, still active service in the U.S. Air Force. So you get a 2-for-1 deal in this episode. You get 2 active duty, 2 lieutenant, colonels in this episode. And we talk about all kinds of different things, such as how he managed to keep the mindset of staying within his top performance, how he got prepared to get ready to go into a combat zone, and how he got his team prepared. We talked about the time that he took over a different established team, and how he got it back on track and up to their peak performance. We talk about why leaders need to commit with courage. And then finally, amongst other topics, we also talk about how to combat the Great Resignation that's still going on. So we hit a whole plethora of different topics here, but it's definitely stuff that is applicable to today. Brian's a rock star guest. Like I said, he's still active duty, although he's preparing his transition to what we refer to as normal life, getting ready to become a civilian again. He's got a Bronze Star, a Distinguished Flying Cross. He has a BA, and as well he is has an MA in aviation instruction. So he's still serving, as I mentioned. He's actually now serving with the Air Force's Combat Search and Rescue, also known as CSAR. That's what we call it up here, which is highly difficult, high danger, and as well as very stressful. So Brian is someone who thrives under pressure, right? And us as leaders, that's where we live. So with further ado, why don't you sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Brian Slade. Brian, my man, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Scott. I'm happy to be here.
This is crazy. We got 2 active serving lieutenant colonels, 2 Afghan veterans on the show here today. I am stoked.
Yeah, except for I'm not a lieutenant. I don't know what that means.
Oh, right. You're a lieutenant.
No, I got you. Yeah, 2 lieutenant colonels. Yeah, jacking it up. I didn't realize you were still active duty.
Yeah, legit. I'm still like busting my butt, 10, 12 hours a day, and then I come home and do this at night.
Yeah, it just means we got to be careful.
Nah, no one in my chain of command cares what I say.
I'm probably in that boat too.
All right, first question. I love asking military folks like this. 1, what drew you into the forces? And 2, why the officer route of it?
Well, I got a mixed answer for that. What drew me into the forces was it was a combination of things. I was patriotic for one, but I also had no way to pay for school. So, 2 birds, 1 stone. And I also was somebody who was always drawn to adrenaline antics, if you will. And here I saw an opportunity where I could, I guess, 3 birds, 1 stone, do something where I could fill that need, pay for school, and, defend the country. So all of those things really just appealed to me. But I didn't start as an officer. I actually did 7 years as an enlisted guy, and then I did what's called the simultaneous membership program, where I was able to get the benefits from being an enlisted guy for school and the benefits of being an officer for school, and it really worked out well for me to see that dichotomy as well, as far as be able to lead as an officer, but understand where the enlisted guy comes from, because I've been there.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a similar program up here too, where the enlisted guys can flip over. There's a couple different streams, but the one that most go through is where same thing, they get sponsored for school, and great for them. They get to keep their pay as enlisted, which is much better than if you're going through what we call the ROTP program, or ROTC down south, right? So those guys getting big bucks compared to us. Going through school. So it's a pretty good gig, but you hit the nail on the head though. They understand, when you have that experience, they have an understanding of what it's like on the front lines per se, turning wrenches, doing this, doing that, doing the work, because they were there, they did it. Right.
Yeah.
So
for me, it was literally turning wrenches. I was a mechanic.
Yeah. I remember that now. So you went from mechanic to, you just made a little minor change in career path from mechanic to, flying Apache gunships. It's no.
Yeah, basically it's a natural path. It's basically the same thing.
Exact same thing.
Yeah.
So pretty badass. Go ahead.
While I was at college doing the RTC, I knew I wanted to fly helicopters, but then what I did is I did this incentive ride thing. They had a Black Hawk show up and say, "Hey, you guys want to check this out?" And we went in there, and of course they tried to make us puke by doing all the things that you didn't know a helicopter could do. And I was like, yes, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. And I didn't realize how, like you just said it, how badass the Apache was until I ended up in the Apache, because that was just a foregone conclusion. I was in a unit already that had Apaches, so that's where I was going to go. And I didn't realize, it is the cream, it is the machine.
So let's talk a bit about going through and the experiences there then. You go through the whole ROTC program, and I'm sure smooth sailing getting through the Apache training. No hiccups.
Well, I mean, first you got to get branched into aviation, which is fairly. When I was doing it, was really competitive because there was so many dudes that wanted to do it that they were like, "Yeah, you got a mold that doesn't look right, you're out." Like there was just like every little thing they were just trying to like weed it through. So there was a little bit of nervousness there that I was going to get weeded out for some nuance, right? But luckily, I made it through all that. In fact, at one point they found like two little granulomas in my lungs, which are fairly common to people that travel, benign in nature, of course. But they were gonna eliminate me for that, and I pushed it to get a waiver because I was like, man, come on, I'm almost there, you know. And then I got to flight school, and when you're in flight school, eh, up until that point in my military career, it wasn't hard for me to be at the top. Like I just had to push, and I was there. I was at the top. When I got to flight school, I realized that was just a bunch of dudes that were in the same boat as me. They never had to work hard to be at the top. So there was all of us like that. And now all of a sudden I'm like, well, crap, I got to work hard to be at the top because these guys are freaking good. They were all smart, and I never was really smart, but luckily the Army gives a lot of weight to physical prowess. And at the time I was pretty physically fit, and that weighted out the smartness, I guess. But these guys were smart and fit. So I was like, oh crap, it's uphill climb. But pushed through that, and then I went to Apache training, and man, when I flew that thing, I got in it, and I was just like, "This is my beast. This is my jam." It's I described it to my parents like it's like a semi because I drove semi at one point. It's like a semi that operates like a Ferrari as far as nimbleness, and it can go in 3D directions. And I was like, it's just so awesome. And if called upon, it can level a city. So.
Yeah, it's so cool. Now you talked about that competitiveness, and obviously even getting to the flight training, and then obviously Apache's being the cream of the crop. Uh, how did you keep the mindset that you're going to, you're going to get through it? How did you manage to keep that mindset, keep operating at that high level? I assume you're competing only so many guys. There's only so many birds, right? So only so many guys are going to get that helo. So how did you keep that mindset of keeping on top of your game throughout the whole flight training and into and eventually into your first cockpit for real?
I mean, honestly, it's just like anything. I played a lot of sports, and I was a decent athlete naturally, but I was super competitive. So I hated sucking. So it's just keep pushing and keep pushing. And if you push harder than those around you, eventually you'll end up being competitive, whether or not it's natural ability or not. And that's really how I feel like I, I was gifted. I wasn't gifted with natural ability in a lot of areas, but I was blessed with that determination. Right. So um, that's pretty much what kept me. It wasn't hard to keep focused. I was like, this is what I want to do. And there's a lot of competition here. And that actually drove me. I was like, I got to stay focused because there is a lot of competition. Guys that are just, some of them are naturally gifted. Some of them were like me, they weren't, but they were very driven, So you just kind of, I thrived off of that. I fed off of that, like, oh, geez, you can't let your guard down because if you do, there's somebody that's more than competent that'll take your place.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you there is instead of looking at the competition as a negative thing, like, oh, I got to compete against these guys day in day out. You took that as a positive thing, like, and use that as your motivator. Like, oh yeah, I'm going to use these guys. These guys are the top. I'm going to use them to motivate me and push me. That iron strength sharpens iron type mentality. Vice having it as a negative mentality and mindset, which I think is amazing because so many people out there would just be in that situation, like, oh, all these, they're just too good. I'm done. I'm tapping out. Vice using them
Well,
in a positive way.
I honestly think that a true competitor craves competition, right? Like you're not super happy when you see it, but you also crave it. You're like, oh man, this all right, here we go. So I would say that I'm not. I used to be like one of those guys that was just ridiculous with competition. Everything was a competition. Hey, let's go to the store. You want to race? Hey, you want to do? Who could do? I'm not like that anymore. I realize that a board game is just a board game.
After we finish the show, you're going to tell me how you've realized that, because I'm still pretty competitive, even when I'm playing trouble with my two boys.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
All
No
right,
life or death.
Let's fast forward here. So you deploy to Canada or Afghanistan. You end up in Kandahar, where I was at one point. But let's go back. Let's go to the beginning. What were you feeling? How did you prepare yourself for that mission? I mean, that mentally with your team as an officer, as a leader, going into your first real mission. How did you get ready to roll?
For me, it was super. It was a surreal type of experience because our unit as a whole, all the experienced guys, they hadn't deployed either. So we didn't really have a lot of guys to be like, "Hey, what's it like down there? What's this? What's it? What can we expect?" It was. We had guys that were experienced in the aircraft, but they weren't experienced. They weren't any more experienced in combat than I was. Right now, I was a platoon leader going down there, and I actually ended up being our unit movement officer and our advon party, which is basically three of us that got downrange before the rest of the unit. So we were the first boots on ground for our unit. And I didn't know what to expect. I was sitting in the back of a C-17, just bouncing up and down with my sergeants, and all three of us are just like, here we go. What is this going to look like? And interestingly enough, my first impressions were very contrary to what I would have thought it was going to be. So we landed in the morning, early morning of in Bagram, is where we landed initially, and I don't know what I was expecting, but I just thought maybe it would like stink or be nasty because it's like war, like it's going to be ugly, whatever. And when that back of that C-17 started to open and we were in the dark, it's kind of like blinding with your eyes. And the first wave of like fresh air from outside hit me, and it didn't stink. Now, granted, if I landed in Kandahar, that'd been a different story. But we landed in Bagram. It actually smelled kind of fresh. And I was like, what? That's weird. And then it continued down, the door continued down, and I saw the mountains. And I just came from I'm from the Rocky Mountains in Idaho and Utah. And I was like, what is going on here? That's actually beautiful. And so it just wasn't what I expected, but in more ways than one, because when we deployed to Afghanistan, it was during a time when Iraq was all the news, right? Iraq was all over the news, and you didn't hear anything about Afghanistan. So we thought it was B team stuff, right? There's just not a lot going on in Afghanistan, and we're going to go fly circles in the sky, and it's going to be kind of boring. Couldn't have been more wrong, obviously. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a book. But really, what stood out to me, and this is what I use to teach perspective with guys, is like when we first started flying and we hadn't engaged with the enemy yet, I would fly over those mountains, and those mountains were beautiful. And then we would get a call, and they would pull. It would be a troops in contact is what they call it, a tick, and we drop out of that beautiful, that serene view that we're looking at, and all of a sudden we are fully engaged in a gunfight, fully engaged with talking to a ground force commander who's breathing heavy, and you hear gunfire in the background, and you can tell it's just chaos on the ground, and they just don't want to get hit with fast moving lead, right? And then we're bringing the heat with much bigger fast moving lead, right? And that's the intent. So everybody is focused now on this gunfight, and I thought there was a really cool lesson in that. In that the problem that we see all over, in Canada and the U.S. is people choosing a permanent solution to a temporary problem, and what I'm talking about is suicide, right? So there's an analogy there when we're talking about being in that gunfight. When you're in the middle of that gunfight, you feel like that's your life. Like that's everything. That's all your focus is on that moment. And it is intense. But that gunfight will end, right? That gunfight is finite. But the cool thing, even in a place as ugly as Afghanistan, as far as what's going on in Afghanistan, even in that place, those mountains are still beautiful. That snow on those mountains is still serene. And as you lift up even higher into altitude, you can see the curvature of the earth, and that's freaking just amazing. And I don't care if you're over the ugliest place on the planet. This is what I always say. I tell this story over and over again. So some people have maybe heard it again, heard it if they listen to several podcasts. But I don't care if you're over the ugliest place on the planet. If you're up at 30,000 feet and you see the curvature of the earth, that is awesome, right? And if you go up into space, which I haven't been, and I probably never will because that doesn't sound fun to me. But if you look at the globe, how amazing is that? And here's the really cool part about that. There is no direction in space. So the beauty doesn't go in every direction. It just is. It just exists. That's the infinite. That's the infinite perspective, not the gunfight that seems infinite and overwhelming when people are in it, both analogously and literally, as we're talking about. When they're in that, that seems like their world, but that's a finite. You might come through with some scars, you might get beat up a little bit, but or but it's finite. It will end. It will end. But the infinite is up there.
Love that, brother, man. What I'm hearing from you is, look to, um, the desired end state, as former Navy SEAL Larry Yatch, another former guest on the show, would say, right? Look to where you need to get to, where you want to be, and it's not necessarily there in that moment, that chaos, but focus, get through it, and you'll get to it, and it'll be okay in the end. Like, I talked to so many people, in 2020, 2021. 2022, the pandemic was wearing on, and so many people were just, oh, I'm so tired of this. I'm like, we'll get there. Like, this is not the first time we've gone through a pandemic. It's our first time, but not us as a species. It's not our first time. We'll get there, because guess what? We're still here. Spanish flu 1918, it happened. It was the same type of thing. And guess what? Oh, we're still here. So I love that perspective thing that you talked about, for sure. And the chaos that goes on, I've been there, like, literally. I've been there, right? I was in Kandahar. I was like, it's interesting. I don't know if I talked about this often, and it'd be interesting to hear if you had a very similar thing, because you kind of hinted at it. But like, when you get there, you're just like, before you've gotten shot at, you're just like, when's someone going to shoot at me? Like you kind of want to get that experience and get it done and over with, so that you know what it's like. Was that something similar for you too?
Oh yeah, it really was. And that may sound weird to people, but for us, when we got into Bagram, we had to split our company up into two places. We put a detachment out of Jalalabad, and then there was the rest of us at Bagram initially. And the guys that were out of Jalalabad were the guys that were getting called in to do all these tick support, right? Where the guys at Bagram primarily were flying escort and ring routes, where we didn't really get into it with the enemy as much. And at this point, it's been a month in or so, I hadn't even, to my knowledge, I hadn't even seen the Taliban, so I I was like, well, but I was starting to hear stories from the guys at Jalalabad of engaging the enemy and all those kind of things. And I'm like, well, I want to do my part. And then they did. There was some leadership challenges out there in Jalalabad, and my commander said, "I'm going to send you out there. I need you to kind of figure out what's what and put it back together the way it needs to be put together." So he made me the detachment commander, and I went out to Jalalabad. Well, I was in Jalalabad, and now once again, now that whatever you want to call it, anxiousness was even amplified, because now I know the potential's increased to go and trade lead with the enemy. And even guys were still coming back, and they're like, they had an engagement, and I got to talk to them right after they had it, and that kind of thing. And I'd go out and we'd get called into a tick, and then the guys nothing would happen. Like, they wouldn't shoot at us or anything. They just disappear. They say, "Hey, we're not going to play today." And it was frustrating. I called it tactical blue balls. I'm just like, man, I'm ready to go, and I can't get this done. And then finally, I had my first engagement, and it was a doozy. I mean, we rolled in, and it was a daytime mission, and we were flying in this really, really steep slot canyon. And on one side of the slot canyon was a convoy they'd had an IED go off, so they were basically in a bad way. They couldn't press down the road, and they were taking fire, but they couldn't tell from where. We thought it was on the opposite side of the canyon, so we were flying over there trying to figure it out. And I had never really seen muzzle flash before in the daytime, so I later realized I was seeing it, but I didn't at this point. I didn't realize that. So as we were flying around, we were actually getting pretty aggressive and pretty low. We were about 20, I don't know, 20, 30 feet over the ground, and then we came out over the valley. So it went from like 20, 30 feet to about 300 feet. And right as that happened, we got rocked with an RPG. I mean, lifted that bird up to where it like I got punched, and punched right in the butthole, right? Like, boom, like picking us up. And it created this. I thought we were hit. I thought we were hit by the RPG, but what had happened is the RPG either airburst below us or slammed into the cliff next to us. And it created this disturbed air that we couldn't bite with our helicopter blades. And so we were falling. And so I thought that's why I'm like, we're hit, man. First fight, we're hit. I'm done. This sucks. I didn't even get a chance to throw a punch, right? And I remember visually just seeing the rock that we were going to hit at the bottom of that ravine. I'm like, that's where we're going to, that's our trajectory right there. But Doug Earl, the guy that was flying the back, CW4, champion of champions, flies that thing out of there. And then there's this really good lesson that's taught to a young lieutenant at the time who just, I probably would have stopped flying the helicopter because I thought we were hit. There was nothing left to do, but he continued to fly the helicopter, which is a lesson for life too. You know, how often are we in the middle of stuff and we feel like it's a foregone conclusion? This is where it's at. This is where it's headed. It's done. When if we just continue to fly the helicopter, just like you were saying with COVID, now it's in the rearview mirror, you know. And he flew us out of that thing. And we came back around, and I started to realize what I was seeing was muzzle flash, and we started to engage the enemy with extreme prejudice, and it was surreal in a way that I'd pulled the trigger on the Apache many times at target practice, but that was the first time, and that was my first time that I knew when I squeezed that trigger that I was taking life. You know, there were men on the other end of that were as convicted in their cause as I was mine. In fact, they were very committed to try to make me lose my life for their commitment. And so was I. And so that exchange and that, well, I would call it, I respect that enemy for that reason, not their cause, but for their conviction, for their ability to go toe to toe with a machine that could kick their ass and did, right? And then we roll back around and we keep fighting, and we did the same thing, right in the same freaking spot. And you know, the definition of insanity is do the same thing twice and expect a different result. But we got the exact same result. Luckily, exact same result because he didn't hit us again. But this time, chunks of rock from the cliff hit the canopy. That's how close it was to everything. And we went sideways this time. But now I had like 10-minute-old wisdom though, so I looked at the instruments. I'm like, oh, we're still good. We're going to catch air and we're going to fly out of this thing, which we did. Annihilate. The guys got their truck fixed and they got down the road. So my first engagement was pretty intense. A lot of lessons to be learned from it, but it was a success ultimately.
Yeah, no, definitely a lot of lessons. And you hit on them, right? When trusting your team members, right? Your pilot at the time.
Yeah, I mean, Doug saved my bacon and taught me so much. Just one moment, he taught me so much.
Absolutely, so much in there. What I'd like to do though, Brian, is go back to Lieutenant Slade. So Lieutenant Slade gets hauled in and says, "Hey, you're off to Jalalabad, and you're going to take over this team. We're parachuting you in. Something's not right, and we need you to take over this team." You know, how do you as a leader then go in to this team that you didn't train with? You know, you knew them because they're part of your unit. And so for the audience who aren't familiar with military lingo and speak, think of like you're in marketing and you're told to just go over to sales and take over a sales team, right? That kind of situation. So you get told to take over the team and now be its leader and run it. So how did you, one, insert yourself into that team, and two, make it gel and perform at that peak performance that obviously you guys needed at that time?
Well, I mean, I did know the guys and we had trained together, but we'd been separated for about 2 months at this point, and their experience of war and my experience of war at that point were completely different, right? So I was the guy coming in that's like, you don't know what's going on, man. We've been here doing this, right? And they were right, and they're correct. So that was the first thing, is I had to acknowledge that they had institutional knowledge that I did not. I had to acknowledge that and say, teach me, right? Teach me what you have. Let me know what's going on here. And here, what I realized pretty quick, open your ears and shut your mouth. But what I realized is the guys that we look to for wisdom, and all those, the guys that were the best pilots because they'd been around for decades doing it, they weren't the guys getting in the fights. It was the young guys that were getting in the fights. And so now you have this interesting out of sequence wisdom attainment, which adds to it another complexity to team building, because it's easy to say the guys that have been flying long enough, they're the guys that are going to have all the answers. That's the natural order of things. But when you got the guys that are younger, actually having answers that the older guys don't have because they haven't had that experience, now you get egos in the way, right? And so what I really had to go in there and do is listen first, figure that out, and then encourage others to listen as well through mediums where we set the stage by having whiteboards where everybody could talk and round tables and those kind of things. And just taking charge and saying, hey guys, everybody's input here is equal because of the consequences, right? When the consequence is death, every time you go out, if you do the thing the wrong way, I think we're going to listen to people that went out there and did it and came back. Whether they did it right or wrong, there's a lesson there. And what we finally started getting was guys, injecting wisdom from all different angles, and it did start to become more cohesive, and we did start to really, really start to wreak havoc against the Taliban and lay some blankets.
What I hear from you is like you instilled what we refer to as a sense of psychological safety, right? You enabled the guys to speak up and speak their minds. And in a military context, it's so easy for us to be able to not do that with our rank structure and a hierarchical structure. You being the lieutenant and then everyone else being, whether they're chief or warrant officers or NCOs or whatever, and you being placed in charge as a commander of that group, it immediately puts in that hierarchy. But instead you did, which a lot of people have a hard time with, you did the inverse. You say, no, everyone's input matters here, because just like you said, lives are on the line. And I remember I was coaching, or I was presenting to a group of business students once, and I kind of went that route. And I said, with the military, we're, end of the day, it's all about saving lives. But look at it from a business context, business standpoint. And I'll make a long story short here, but I said it's the exact same thing, because at the end of the day, if you're a poor leader and your organization, your business fails, then people don't have jobs, they don't have money, they don't earn money to put bread on their tables and provide for their families and keep a roof over their head. It's their lives on the line, just like that too. And if you look at it from that context, you need to go in every day and you need to fight, but you need to do it in a way that you're, one, inspiring, two, motivating, and three, enabling your team to achieve its best.
Yeah, I learned a pretty valuable lesson as a high school kid trying to compete in football. And I started late. I started as a sophomore in high school, but I ended up being pretty good, and good enough to even get picked up by colleges and sit on the bench. But basically that good, right? Good, but not that good. So one thing my coach said that really just rang true with me, and I started applying it, and basically I still apply it in everything I do. And that is, if you'll engage something with commitment, true commitment, not knowing what the outcome will be, just commitment and courage, right? Because not knowing what the outcome may be requires courage. You don't know where this is going to go. You don't know how crazy this is going to get, right? And then the equal sign on that equation is increased capability. As you apply commitment and courage to anything, you will have increased capability. And from increased capability, you get increased confidence. And then you can start that cycle all over again. So it's just this building equation that just builds on itself and builds on itself. But in high school, I don't know if this is how he intended me to apply it, but, and this is in the book, this story, you probably read it. When I went to tackle a guy, one of my guys came from the other side and hit my hand at the same time I was tackling him. And it literally shoved my middle finger all the way back into my hand. And so, like, folded up on itself and shoved it back in my hand. So to anybody looking at the hand, I have 3 fingers and a thumb and a bloody stump, right? That's really what it looked like. Well, I didn't look at it immediately. It happened, it hurt, and I shook it and I didn't look at it. I was just like, oh, and I didn't think the finger was gone. I was just like, it hurt. And then I went to the next play and I got down to go into the next play. And as my hand hit the ground, there was no return pressure for my middle finger. I looked down and it was gone. And I was like, oh my gosh, I lost my finger, you know? But now we're in the play. So we did the play. I actually got the tackle. This is something that we figured out later. We watched the video and they're like, you actually got the tackle after you were missing your finger, you know? And I was like, yeah, you know, you do what you do. And then I came out and I was tapping my helmet and my coach is yelling at me because I never left the game. I was on there from start to finish, offense, defense, all special teams. And he's like, what the hell are you coming off the field for? And I'm like, coach, I'm not sure, but this doesn't look right, you know? And he's like, oh crap. And one of the, you know, they're like, we're going to stop this game and find a finger. And I was sitting there on the sideline holding my hand, kind of queasy. And one of the athletic trainers came over, or coaches, and they're like, look, I think your finger's in your hand. I can see your fingernail sticking out. And so they said, you just need to pull on that. Right. And so, I had to they grab my arm. Are you okay? I'm like, yeah, I'm just about to pass out. And then I went into halftime and back then they could say this. I don't think you could get away with it now, but they said, are you willing to go back you want to go back out and play? I said, yeah. So commitment, right? Courage. This is where the courage came in. In my head, that's where this applied, commitment and courage. And so it hurt like a bitch, but we wrapped it all up. And we went back out there and I played that game and the rest of the season. But that was just a powerful lesson to me. And I don't think my coach meant it by like play with a finger shoved back in your hand, but that's how I took it. And it still drove a lesson deep inside of me, is that I just got better and better. And it was because of that commitment and courage, it increased my capability. And then, like I said, an average athlete was selected to be at a D1 school, and that's where the benefit, that's where the payoff comes.
Yeah, I almost threw up at that section of the book, by the way. Oh God! Like, audience member, you got a weak stomach. You do not want to read that story because I almost threw up.
I was queasy, almost blacked out. I mean, I kept.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
I'm taking some doozies myself. Nothing like that. But what I want to hit at though is like that courage and commitment that you showed as an individual. Or sorry, what I want you to hit on after is like, how did that inspire your team? Like, did that rally your team?
So that's that's the whole point of that story, and I didn't even finish it. Right. So when I'm out there doing that, right, everybody wanted to be engaged in that game more. They're like, dude, if he's out here with a busted hand, freaking we can suck it up and play the best of our abilities. And that was really one of the other lesson to that whole thing was I learned that if you never ask anybody to do anything you're not willing to do yourself. It doesn't mean you have to do it, but you got to be willing to do it, because sometimes roles and responsibilities dictate that you're not going to do it. But never ask them to do anything you're not willing to do. They'll know if you wouldn't be willing to do it yourself. But when you do something, do it with intensity and do it with purpose, and people won't just follow you. They'll want to follow you. They won't follow you because they feel like they have to. They'll feel like you because they will follow you because they feel like they want to be part of that. They want to be part of that supporting crew. They want to be part of that win. They want to be part of that fight. And so, yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because that lesson was very, very important. And it applies to military, it applies to business, it applies to relationships, it applies to pretty much anything you can think of.
Yeah, it totally does, right? I love that, wrap up. You got to show that you're willing to do what you're asking your team to do, because if you're not, like you said, they'll see right through it. They'll see right through
it.
They
will.
And you talked a lot about commitment and courage. I'm just wondering from your experience and stuff like this, I'll preface the question with what I'm hearing a lot right now from leaders is, people aren't committed. We have the great resignation going on. There's this problem with their team. There's that problem with their team. How do I do this with my team? And ultimately I'm getting at is like, how do we instill this in our team in this day and age from your experience and your standpoint, so that we don't have these issues and that our team themselves are actually committed and they're going out with courage and they're taking, the ones that are taking their fingers out of their hands and going up for the next tackle and stuff like this. How do we get our teams, aligned with that?
Well, I think the first thing you hit on is ownership. It's ownership. These guys were, oh, we can't do it because this culture or this that culture. I'm not arguing whether the culture's changed or not. That is true. I can't even say probably. That is true. Culture's changed. But are you a leader or you're not? If you're in charge, you're in charge. And that means that ownership is on you, right? And those same truths hold. You still lead with intensity, you still lead with purpose, you still don't ask them to do anything you aren't willing to do yourself. But if you do that and you hold yourself accountable, you have every right to hold them accountable as well, right? And as they see that pattern, the guys that you want to keep, you'll keep, right? The guys that you'll want on your team, they will rise up and be on your team, right? There's also a filtering process. If they don't want to be there and that's all the way that you're leading that way, those aren't the guys you want on your team anyway, right? So, but I would argue that most people will rise. Most people will rise. Most people have more potential than they even realize themselves. Actually, I'd say all people, every person has more potential than they can realize because in my mind's eye, we have infinite potential. So you'll never understand it. You can never categorize it. You can never put a cap on it. You cannot define it because I think we have infinite potential, you know.
That, my friend, is the quote of the show right there. Infinite potential. I absolutely love it. But I liked what you hit on, and that is the accountability aspect and showing up and leading with intensity and leading with passion and conviction and purpose. I think right now what's happening is a lot of leaders out there feel like they need to walk on eggshells. Oh, I don't want to hurt their feelings or piss them off because I'm scared they're going to leave. Well, I think that's actually the wrong way to go about it. I think when people see that, you know, you have a team there that's holding each other accountable, not in a negative way, like, oh, you screwed up, you're sack, you don't know what you're doing. Like, hey, you got this wrong. Come here. Let me teach you. Let me empower you. Let me lift you up. This is how I'm going to hold you accountable. I'm going to actually empower you. I'm going to teach you what you need to do, empower you to do it, and then follow up from time to time if you go astray a little bit to get you back on the right track. That is actually more motivating than going, oh, you made a mistake, but I'm just going to fix it here. And the employee sitting there going, well, the boss doesn't really care what I do. I can do whatever I want. No, this is actually boring and sucks, and I'm not motivated because I'm not being actually challenged. So, oh, what's this over here? Oh, look at this job posting. Oh, yeah, that looks interesting. To give me a little bit more pay. Let's give it a shot. Right? Like, to me, that's the
Yeah,
problem going on right now.
and it starts with holding yourself
Oh,
accountable.
100%.
Hold yourself accountable, and then all roads lead from there, right? So, and and they'll see that. Just like when what we talked about earlier. If you're asking people to do things you're not willing to do, they'll know that. And the opposite is true. If you're asking people that do things that you're more than willing to do, they'll know that, and they will either feel a desire or drive to rise up to that, or or they're probably not the person you want in that position. Which, like I say, I'll reiterate this: most of the time they'll rise. Most of the time they will rise. So there's not a lot of those dead weight people. Well, I'm still active duty. You're still active duty. Like, combat search and rescue is my game these days. And we get a lot of new guys coming in, and yeah, they have a little bit more lackadaisical view on life altogether. But once they start feeling that camaraderie and that team unity and that credo of that others may live, and know that they have a crucial part in that, they're there. They're committed. They put it all over their cars. They put it all over everything. I mean, I don't do that, but like, they wear the swag. They're proud to be part of that, right? And if guys not producing or not giving it, we'll give them a hard time if they do wear that crap. Like, hey, you ain't earned that stuff yet. And that's part of the camaraderie too.
Yeah, I currently work at a high readiness unit. So for what that means to the audience is like I show up at work every day not knowing if I'm coming home. And I've been at times where I looked at one of my guys, I'm like, hey, I need you to go and I need you to go Thursday. He's like, all right. And this was Tuesday. right? Like 48, less than 48 hours notice. And that's just the life we live. But when people are getting screened, like we go through a process, we call it the screening process to check to make sure that they're good before they're formally sent to us. I call them up before we even get to that point. And I say, hey, this is what life's like here. Let me run down. I'm like, are you all in or are you all out? Because if you're not all in, that's cool. I don't mind. This gig ain't for everybody. If you say yes, then I need you in. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay, let's go. So I bring them in and we get, bring them into the team and stuff like this. And we empower them and like, hey, this is your job. This is what I need you to do. And what you need, I got your back. I'll do whatever I can. But it's that team aspect of camaraderie. But again, that's that accountability saying, hey, this is what the organization expects from you. And I need to know whether or not you can achieve that. Because if you can't, well, thanks, but no thanks. But if you can,
I agree.
But if you can, but you're like, hey, I'm not comfortable in this area or that area, no big deal. We can work with that.
Yeah, and I like something you said there is, this this game isn't for everybody, and that's true. There is a game for everybody. This might not be it. You know what I mean? Like we all have our own skill sets and capabilities, and for the most part, we naturally filter to where we can belong. And that's why I say most of the time they'll rise because they already naturally filtered that way. They already chose in several times, right? And so even if they're putting forth that minimalistic effort or maybe even have an attitude problem, they've already done things that say, I want to be here. Right. So most of the time, if we take ownership and we lead, they'll follow. But every once in a while, we get it wrong. And it's just not a good fit. It's just not a good fit. And that's a leadership challenge in and of itself. You need to exercise tumors. If the tumor's there and it's a tumor and it's malignant, having taken that hard stance is actually better for the health of the whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Or you end up finding a better fit for that person where they're, more productive, happier,
Yes.
feel part of the team. So for the leaders out there, what Brian is saying isn't like necessarily, it may come to the point where you need to terminate, but you can also go ahead and try different things before you get to that point. Like, okay, you're not great here in IT. Let's try, or data entry. Let's try you somewhere else. Let's try you in this job. How about
Yeah.
that job? What actually interests you? And actually have that conversation. But if someone has a character flaw where they show up and they're like a cancer or they're causing conflict left, right, and center, then yeah, that's got to go, 100%.
Yeah, so we recently just had an experience with this. We had an officer come over from the finance branch, thought they wanted to be a pilot, right? More than competent, got scared, right? And we tried to work through that, tried to do all these things, but it was just this phobia that was amplifying and growing. But this officer actually had this phenomenal skill set with administrative and clerical stuff because they came from the finance. They just could do all kinds of things that a lot of us pilots have to do in our jobs because they make us do it. And we're like, we hate that crap. Right. And, and so that's a perfect fit for her. She's killing it. She's getting all that stuff done. And she's more grateful now of that job because she experienced the one that just wasn't a good fit. She's like, you know what? I was where I was supposed to be. This is where I need to be, and I can contribute here. And she does.
That's an awesome story. Brian, man, we could go all night. Unfortunately, all good things got to come to an end, brother. But before we wrap up, I do got a couple last questions for you. And the first question is a question I ask all the guests here at the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. And that is, according to you, Brian Slade, what makes a great leader?
Uh, I would say ownership. We talked on it. You got to take ownership of your stuff first, right? You do that first, and people will follow. Leadership. There's all kinds of important aspects, but I think if you take ownership, you can hone all those other aspects.
Yeah, I could definitely sense that coming. It's interesting. A lot of the military guests or former military guests, they have something along the lines of ownership, accountability, stuff like that, which gets bred into us pretty quick, which is definitely, I say, a good thing. All right, final question of the show. How can people find you, follow you? Shameless plug. It's all about you now, man. Have at it. You're cleared hot.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you all the links that you can apply at the thing, but I am on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram under Brian Slade on all of them. Clearedhot.info, www.clearedhot.info is my website. Amazon, you can get the book. It's at some bookstores, but don't waste your time going to bookstores. Just order it on Amazon. It'll come to your front door. You can get it on my website too, but if I'm honest, it gets to your house faster with Amazon. And I'm not plugging Amazon, but it is just faster that way. But I'll shoot you the links, and anybody that feels like this reached out to them in any way, we do have some follow-on trainings too that primarily help with resilience.
Yeah, and for the listeners, always, it's easy. Go to lead.boss.com/248. Links are in the show notes. Brian, my friend, it's been an honor. It's been a pleasure. Lieutenant Colonel Brian Slade, thank you very much.
Lieutenant Colonel, thank you much.
And that's a wrap for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. But you know what you could do to truly support the podcast? And no, that's not leaving a rating and review. It's simply helping a friend. And that is helping a friend by sharing this episode with them if you think this would resonate with them and help them elevate their performance level, whether that's within themselves, their teams, or their organization. So do that. Help me, help a friend, win-win all around. And hey, you look like a great friend at the same time. So just hit that little share button on your app, and then feel free to fire this episode to anyone that you feel would benefit from it. Finally, there's always more. There's always more lessons around being the highest performing leader that you can possibly be, whether that's for yourself, your team, or your organization. So why don't you subscribe? Subscribe to the show via movingforwardleadership.com/subscribe. And until next time, lead, don't boss, and thanks for coming out. Take care now.